You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode number 30. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Hello, my friends. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you join me here this week. We have a very special guest. Her name is Natalie Fisher, and she's a certified career and mindset coach. Natalie and I dive into all things job search related. And for a little sneak preview of what's in store for you, we are going to talk about how to know when it's time to leave your job. And then we talk about the mechanics and strategy of the job search process. So we'll talk about things like networking and how to do it effectively, especially if you're an introvert. We talk about situational interviews, what they are, and what you can do to prepare for them. We also talk about what to do when you find yourself getting stuck at a certain stage of the job search process. So maybe you're really good at getting the interview, but you don't seem to make it past that stage. And finally, we talk about mindset shifts that you can make that will result in a more effective and successful job search. So I know you're excited to meet her, and I know you're going to love her. So let's meet Natalie. Thank you so much for tuning in. Enjoy our interview, and I look forward to seeing you all again next week. Bye for now. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm so excited to be introducing today's guest. Her name is Natalie Fisher. Natalie is a career and mindset coach. She has an amazing podcast called Get a Six-Figure Job You Love, and I've had the pleasure of working with Natalie, not in relation to getting my own six-figure job, but in relation to creating this very podcast that you are listening to right now. And I knew when I was working with Natalie that I really wanted to have her as a guest on this podcast because she has so much valuable information to share for anybody who is looking for a job or thinking about looking for a job or who's in that process of looking for a job. And so I'm so pleased to have Natalie here today. Natalie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I could not be more excited.
I could not be more excited either. It really has been such a pleasure just working with you, Natalie. You're amazing. And granted, we were working on the creation of this podcast, so we were coaching around all sorts of issues in relation to that. But what are the coaching questions or the topics that you normally coach your clients on?
Yeah. So I'm a coach for professionals of all different industries, but I have worked with several lawyers before too. And basically I help them to create their six-figure job that checks all their boxes. So to get what they want. And a lot of times we're looking at like what's available and try to fit into those boxes. And I'm kind of shifting it so that you can make the decision about what you want and then go get that. So short story, that's what I help people do.
Fabulous. And it's like you're moving away from here's the checklist that the employers are seeking and putting the control almost back in the hands of the job seeker by having them look more intentionally for what they want and then finding a match. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Fabulous.
And I mean, it's got to be a win-win both ways, but a lot of people just kind of don't even know what's possible for them. So
I love that. And we're going to get into that more as we have our conversation. Absolutely. Natalie, I think for a lot of lawyers, a lot of the clients that I have worked with, some of them are thinking of making a transition. They're thinking about leaving their job. What would you say are some of the signs, or how would you know if it's time for you to move on from your existing job?
Yeah, absolutely. And I really love this question when you posted. A whole bunch of stuff came up. So the first thing I would say, if you are having that feeling like you want to leave, like you want to look at that, you want to be like, why? And you want to have reasons, really, like you want to list out some reasons why you want to leave. So I've worked with many people, and in some cases, the environment is not a good environment for them. They're either not fitting in, or in some cases, it's them that could be the problem. And they might go somewhere else and find the exact same issues appearing in a different environment. So I would kind of do some assessing as to whether or not it is a toxic environment, and some like indicators of that might be, people just being disrespectful, no failure is tolerated, no mistakes are allowed. And I know that like maybe you can speak to this in the legal community, because I know that happens a lot, but I also know that we're all human, and and we have to manage these mistakes somehow, even if like we do it in a productive way or an unproductive way. So looking at like, is it a toxic environment? Is it really the environment, or is it something that you can shift within yourself that maybe it's uncomfortable for you, and maybe you need to move out of your comfort zone to maybe provide more value in that? So without knowing the specifics, that's kind of what I would say, because a lot of the times people can move to another job and then they can end up just bringing their problems with them and being unhappy anyway. And sometimes it is definitely the environment, and they can move environments and thrive in a different environment.
Yeah, I think that's such a great answer, Natalie, because it really does set up that dichotomy. On the one hand, it may be the environment that you're working in. And you mentioned if it's a toxic work environment, I imagine also if it's an environment where that movement just isn't available for you. I mean, some jobs have a ceiling. And so maybe you've outgrown that job, and those would be external circumstances, things that exist outside of you that you can't really change on your own, versus the other piece that you've identified, which is what is your role in that organization? And is there something that you can be doing to make that job more aligned with what you're wanting from it, I guess?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really good point. Yeah, I love that point about, and a lot of times there isn't any room for growth. And like, that's a completely legitimate reason to say, I'm taking this other opportunity because there's more room for growth. And anybody would understand that who also has the want to move forward and advance. And I think also touching on that point about whether or not it's you or the environment, it's kind of like, can you honestly say to yourself, I've done everything that I can here to make this work. I'm really proud of how I've been showing up. I've added the most value that I possibly could. If you can say all those things and you're still ready to move on, then that's probably a good sign that it is the right time for you.
Yeah, that is such a great point. Thank you so much, Natalie. I imagine, so when the clients that you work with, when they come to you, what kind of challenges are they having?
Yeah, so mainly like the most general challenges are low self-confidence due to having failed in the past. So a very common one is they've been rejected several times and their confidence has decreased from those rejections. So they've made those rejections mean something about their value. So they have low confidence, and that's been going on for a while. So it's difficult for them to build that back up on their own. And then another challenge is low belief that what they're going after exists, that it can happen for them. And then going back to the value piece, they've kind of lost sight of their own value, right? Like they've done a lot of great things. They've had a lot of great results, but that's not at the forefront of their mind at all. And that's where we start.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to hear you say that, Natalie, because it makes me think of some of the lawyers that I've worked with where, to your first point, the rejection point. And for some lawyers, there's a real transition point. Maybe they're moving from one city to another city and they're putting their CV out there and they're trying to make some inroads in the application process and they're not getting any traction. And so then they start to lose confidence, as you said, or that belief piece that you just mentioned. Lawyers who have been working in a particular field for a number of years and they may not see it as being possible to transition out of, say, litigation into solicitor work or vice versa. And so what I love about your approach is that you don't come at that equation thinking that there is a predetermined way to get to a certain job, that there are skills that you're developing en route that you can then bring with you into a new capacity. And it's that belief point that if the applicant is seeking it and believing that it's possible to find something, that they approach that quest with a different energy.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I do find that that is very common thinking. It's very rigid. It's like, well, in order to do this, I have to have done this before, or I have to do this next. That's just how it is. That's just the path. And sometimes people will try to explain that to me like it's fact. And my job is to not buy into that story and question it and be like, well, is it? Like, could there be a different way? What about this? What about this kind of thing? And then they kind of start to open up and be like, okay, maybe I was, kind of too rigid along the path. And I think that's an important thing when you're going somewhere, is to allow yourself to kind of be flexible with how you decide to get there versus this is how it has to be. And that's where a lot of people can get stuck.
Absolutely. And I love that you're bringing that approach to the lawyers, for example, that you're working with, because I think often in a law situation, there can be a lockstep system, and it may seem like there's a path that you follow. Lawyers work with rules. And so I think there's a tendency to see the rules that are already in place. And so your work there is really questioning whether those rules are, whether they exist, whether, how much you're bound by them, and what happens if you try experimenting, as you've suggested, trying different things and seeing where that takes you.
Yeah. And I think like that's a good point too, because your whole job is rules as lawyers, and they serve you, right? They serve us. The law serves us. Like, we need that, right? So there's a place for rules, and then there's a place where they don't serve us, and we can actually let go of a lot of them, and it can become a lot easier to get where we're going. So there's a time and place for rules, but sometimes they get in the way, especially if they're not real.
Absolutely. Absolutely. When lawyers are looking for jobs, often there's this notion of finding an environment where there's a really good fit. And I'd be curious to know what your recommendations would be for somebody who's trying to find an organization, whether it's a law firm, whether it's an organization where you'd be working in-house or in another capacity, how you would set yourself up for finding a good fit.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's a great question too. So the first thing is deciding what that fit looks like for you. So deciding what kind of environment you want to be working in, how it would feel, what kind of work you would get to do, how the people would be. And then exploring and having conversations with people in other law firms, having conversations with people and asking them, like, what's it really like to work there? What's a day in the life there? Like, how does it work for you? Right. And then just being open to the understanding that there's a bunch of different ways to do things, even in law firms. One's going to run one way, one's going to run a completely different way. There's going to be, like, I have one client right now I'm working with, and he's a lawyer for government, and he wants to transfer to private sector. He knows the differences there, and he wants to transfer to private sector for a reason, because he believes he'll be a better fit. So just kind of exploring, first deciding what that would ideally look like for you, and then exploring, kind of building that belief that there is a place available that meets that criteria, and being open to that. And then it's going to be a lot easier for you to find it. And when you're interviewing, you'll be asking questions about how they operate to figure out if it is the right fit and if it does align with you, versus just trying to do everything that they want and be able to be everything to them. You'll also be asking questions about how you'll fit in, how it'll work for you.
It's so fabulous. You've got a podcast episode that just aired, I guess, in the last couple of days, about finding or creating that premium job offer.
Yes.
And I started listening to it. I haven't finished it yet, but you start out talking about designing that premium job offer for yourself, and that it's going to look different for everybody. What kind of steps would you recommend somebody take to get clarity around what their ideal job or what the perfect fitting job would look like for them?
Yeah, absolutely. So one great way to start is by recalling what you don't like, what you don't want, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. What do you not want to do more of?
Because sometimes it's hard to be like, oh, I want this and I want this and I want this. And it sounds like it's pie in the sky, but you know for sure you know what you don't want, right?
Yeah.
And we have to experience what we don't want in order to move into what we do want. And I've done a lot of that in my life. I don't know about you, but I think that's probably the first step, is to go there and be like, well, these are the things I didn't like about my previous position, or these are the things that I know I definitely don't want, right? So, for example, a place where they don't tolerate any mistakes, or they are very hard on you, or there's, like unreasonable expectations, things like that. Like there's jobs out there where people are under a lot of pressure. They have a lot of anxiety all the time, and it's not a healthy environment for them. So I think we can all safely say we don't choose that. That's not our first choice. So where do we want to be, and how do we want to feel in that environment, and what kind of people do we want to be working with, and like what kind of law do you want to be practicing and why, and what is it that you like about it? And then talking to people who are doing that thing that you want to be doing, and talking to different people, because they're all going to have a different perspective on that same type of work. They'll all have a different perspective on it. They'll be working in a different place. So just exploring what's out there would be the next step, so that you can kind of build the evidence for yourself that there is really great environments out there that you can be a part of.
Yeah, and I think that ties back to what you said in the introduction, which is moving away from this idea that there are existing precedents, if you want to call them that, places where you can go and apply to it. Those jobs, of course, exist, but the way you're describing it, it's almost like you start within. You start looking at what you don't like. You start looking at what you do like. Then you start that exploring phase so that you're seeing what else is out there. What are other people doing? And so it doesn't sound like it's like step one, let's apply for every job that you see on the job poster board. It's really getting clear about what you like, what you dislike, your strengths, and then going from that place to then explore and find. So I think that really aligns with what you said at the beginning. Like, let's take control of the process and tailor it to ourselves.
Yeah, I kind of have a plan. Be like, I know this is what I want. Because when you know this is what you want, you're going to be able to identify it a lot easier. And so what I can hear people saying or thinking as they listen to this is, well, yeah, we can't just pick what we want and then go have it. Like I've had clients say that. They're like, no, you have to cater to what the market needs. And yes, that's true. But you already have something to offer that is needed, right? So like if you're a lawyer, you have a skill, it is needed. You get to decide where you add that value.
And I think being so intentional about it in the job seeking phase, and then carrying out that intentionality once you're in the role, right? And really shaping that role around the strengths that you have, and having that self-determination is such a key ingredient for finding work that is fulfilling to you, where you really enjoy what you're doing, and where you're best poised to grow.
Yeah. And if you take care of that in the interview phase, you're going to be much more likely to end up in a place that supports that growth for you and wants to see you succeed and helps you do that.
I love that. And you have such great advice on interviewing. And for anybody listening who is going through the interview phase, I highly recommend searching through Natalie's podcast episodes, because there's something in there for pretty much every situation. And it's so helpful just to have that guidance and to have Natalie's voice in your ear, offering some ideas and suggestions and examples of what that can look like.
I think it's a really fun process. So I know a lot of people like hate it. They're like, oh, this is the worst. But I actually think it's really fun. So I think that's one thing you can get from the podcast is come on over and it'll kind of change the way that you're seeing the job hunt process.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because that's a huge part of it. Natalie, one of the things that I wanted to ask you is about situational interviews. And I understand that, I mean, for some firms, the hiring process is very conversational. It's casual. It's less about fixed questions, but some firms are moving toward more of a situational type of interview situation, especially when they're doing recruiting, for example, where they're interviewing a large number of candidates and they want to level the playing field so that everybody has a fair chance to resonate, to compete, to shine. What would you recommend for those who are, maybe if you wouldn't mind maybe giving a bit of context to what a situational interview is?
I was
for
going to go there for sure.
Gone through it, who doesn't know what we're talking about, and how you would recommend approaching that type of interview.
Yeah, absolutely. So situational, and sometimes known as behavioral interview questions or situational interview questions, are questions where they ask you, tell me about a time when you blah, blah, blah. So tell me about a time when you went through a challenging situation and how you overcame it. Like these are very standard. They're asked in pretty much every interview. And the reason that they ask them is because they want to get an insight on who you are. They want to know how you deal with things when things are not going well. They want to know, your accomplishments. And then like a situational interview is just where those are the standard questions and they've just got a list of them. And so a lot of people struggle to answer these because if they don't have stories that they've thought of, then they're kind of on the spot. They're like, what do I say for this? Right? So yeah, in my program, and a big part of what I teach is helping you come up with these stories and helping you feel really confident about the stories that you're deciding to share in the interview. And I think that the reason why I was very successful job interviewing is because I have really good stories to tell, because I've come up with them over my career and I enjoy telling the stories. So I don't really think of them as I have to impress this person with this story. I think of it as I'm going to share this story because it was either there was a funny part, or I was proud of it, or it just shows something I went through that will connect me to the interviewer, is relatable. So there's two types. One is where you're going to be the hero in the story and you're going to tell them about something you did that was great. And then there's another type where they're going to ask you about a mistake you made or a time you failed. And that's also really important because they want to know how you're going to be when things are not always going well. So the way that you answer that is just as important as how you answer when you have been really successful doing something. So this is a topic I could talk about for a long time. So the original question was, what would be my advice preparing? Is that what the original question was?
Yeah. Although I'm fascinated. Please go on. I'm thinking about the hero stories, the stories where it's a learning lesson.
Exactly. Yeah. So the advice that I would have is you kind of want to know what you're going to talk about. So I have a freebie that we can offer to your audience if they are interviewing. It has 10 examples of the most common situational behavioral interview questions. And so they're like a time you received feedback, a time you made a mistake, a time you disagreed with somebody, a time that you were successful, a time you overcame a challenge. And there's just a lot of examples. So I would say looking at examples really helps me personally and has helped a lot of my clients just to kind of see, oh, okay, this is the type of thing that I would want to be talking about. And then when you look through the examples, you're like, oh, yeah, I did something similar to that, or I could do this, or it kind of sparks your own inspiration because you've got your own experiences.
I've seen that resource. I remember looking at it a few months ago, and it's wonderful. And if I remember correctly, you talk about the underlying question, right? For each of those situational questions, they're asking you something deeper. And when you're looking at the question from that perspective, it becomes so much easier to then figure out which story is most applicable, where you're demonstrating the skill that they're asking for.
Yeah, exactly. You got it. Yeah. And exactly. And that's why I do that, because then you can kind of put yourself in their shoes. It's like they want to assess, what it would be like if they were to get into a disagreement with you, right? What are they going to be experiencing if they have to tell you something that, if they have to give you a piece of feedback that's a bit uncomfortable or something, how are you going to respond to that? And so they want you to tell them how you've responded in the past. So, and then that's another thing, like when you're interviewing, people normally see it as kind of like an interrogation. They're put on the spot. They feel pressure. But think of it if you were interviewing somebody because you're looking to hire, like you're going to want some information about this person. You're going to want a heads up about what it's going to be like. So kind of gets you into the space of compassion and being like, yeah, I understand why you'd want to know that. This is my story about that.
Totally. And Natalie, I think you do such a great job of this whole exercise of taking yourself out of the interviewee's position and looking at it from the perspective of the interviewer. And as I was preparing for our podcast today, I was listening to one of your episodes about the perspective of the hiring manager and really flipping the perspective. And I think so often we go into interviews thinking that, and these are points that you make, but the idea here being that we think that there are these boxes that we need to tick, and we're thinking about, okay, how do I tick the boxes? How do I come across in a way that I'm getting the answers correct? And as a result, we're not showing up as our true selves. We're showing up a little bit robotic sometimes or a bit formulaic versus showing up as a human being, somebody who the person who's responsible for hiring can see as a potential colleague, somebody that they would want in their office working alongside with. And so taking those different perspectives and really taking the pressure off, am I getting the answer to this question correct? And showing up with that. I think you talk about showing up in service, thinking about the value that you're bringing to that equation is such a powerful mindset shift, which I think is why for you an interview context is fun versus others who may see the interview process as something that is really daunting, right? Where there's a right and a wrong. And if you don't get it right, then that's, there are consequences that flow from that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. You nailed it. And one of the thoughts that I do the most coaching on is I need to get this right. And if you think, how does it feel when you think I need to get this right? It's almost always going to be a lot of pressure put on yourself.
As your former client, Natalie, I think you do an excellent job of really narrowing down for your client what is going on? We talked about, that you're a mindset coach, that your career mindset, that so much of the way that we show up is an extension of the words that we're saying to ourselves. And so, as you pointed out, if you're putting all this pressure on yourself, how is it that you're showing up? And what are other ways that you can think about the situation that are more empowering, that lead to that different, more expansive energy, where you're creating the type of impression that you want to be creating with your prospective employer versus that more high pressure energy?
Exactly. And the great thing is that when you can do this, you stand out automatically because everybody else is doing this to themselves. And so they're showing up robotic and unsure of themselves and trying to get it right. And if you can just show up confidently as who you are with short stories to tell and value to share, that automatically makes you the person who stands out.
Absolutely. And I think in your podcast about hiring managers, you talked about that, right? Like when even at that pre-interview stage where the application materials are going in, I think you identified 4 different categories of application, and some of them, the person who's reviewing them may just think, okay, well, they didn't get my name right, or they didn't get the company name right. And, are they even applying for this job? There's sort of that level. And then there's the other end of the spectrum where it's like, okay, this person really stands out on their paper alone. This is the must meet pile. And so thinking about it from that perspective, from the perspective of the person who's doing the intake, can be so powerful in terms of the way that you're showing up at all stages.
Yeah. And it makes it really easy for the person who's on the other side, because I've been on that side screening the resumes too. So it really helps.
Exactly.
Helps you and helps them.
Exactly. Natalie, one of the questions that comes up quite a bit is how to find job opportunities and to see what's out there. And you alluded to this a bit earlier when we were talking about exploring, right? Figuring out who else has the job that you think that you would like. And I'd love for you to share your perspective on the role that networking plays in the job search process.
So people have a lot of connotations around the word networking, and I get a lot of resistance around it. People don't want to do it and stuff. And I've done a few podcast episodes on it. But I would say first, like, some people do get through the job application process. They'll be able to apply with their resume. They'll be able to get through that way. That does happen. So if that's you, then you don't have to network if you're getting interviews without that. So where networking comes in is I like to use all the strategies. It's like, why just stick to one, especially if it's not working? And it also makes the process more fun when you get to connect with other people. And I feel like it inspires you along the way. I recommend starting with exploring, especially if you're not quite sure what you want yet, and having really like pressure-free conversations with people, just telling them kind of what you're planning to transition to or what you're doing. And when you have a conversation with somebody and I kind of treat it like a game. Like, I'm like, how can I help this person? If there was any way that I could help this person, how might I do it? Right? And people often don't want to have networking conversations because they think I'm just asking for something. I'm just begging them for a job. They're not going to help me anyway. This is normally people's narratives beforehand. Right?
Absolutely.
So
people get nervous about approaching people. Absolutely. For those reasons.
And it's uncomfortable to talk to people you don't know. To that, I would say LinkedIn exists for that exact reason. So we should be using it. So I like to shift it as just having conversations, asking them kind of how they got into the role they're in. Why do they like it? How did they get into it? I'm fascinated by getting into their heads and being like, what were your thoughts about it? Like, because a lot of people have done really amazing things, made big transitions, landed roles. And I'm interested to know about their interview process and how they did it. And so when you express interest for somebody else, the reciprocity law comes in and they automatically want to know about you afterwards. And if there's any possible way that they can help you, 9 times out of 10, they will. And so I'd like to take the pressure off the networking completely, not make it like, oh, I have to get a job out of this, or this is the only reason I'm doing it. Make it like a game, a fun thing that you can do, and just start having conversations. And like the majority of my clients have found their jobs that way. So I think it plays a huge role, especially if you want to do it faster, if you want to have more fun doing it, and if you want to build a network that's going to bear fruit for the rest of your life, because you make these connections now, years down the line, they're still going to be like, oh yeah, I remember talking to you. We have an opening now.
Absolutely. I love that last point, Natalie, because that has certainly been my experience. Mm-hmm. Some of the individuals that I'm thinking in particular when I transitioned into coaching from law and reaching out to, because there weren't too many lawyers turned counselor or coach. And so I reached out to a number of them, and they've become part of my social and professional networks. And so that idea that you're setting up the groundwork for some really good relationships, regardless of whether that person is going to offer you a job, it's still, you're building. I'd love to know what you recommend for lawyers maybe who feel a little bit shy about reaching out to people. There are some lawyers who are quite introverted, who would much prefer not to have to reach out to people. Do you have any ideas for how they might approach others?
Yeah. So I'm kind of like, if I've taken the Myers-Briggs test, and I'm like just slightly over the line to be extrovert, but mostly introverted. But I coach a lot of introverts, and what I find for them is they're really good at having one-on-one conversations. They're just more uncomfortable, like in a large group. They would much rather have a few quality conversations than 100 surface level conversations. And so I actually think networking plays to their strengths, because networking is, when it comes down to it, and it's going to be a meaningful exchange, is going to be a one-on-one conversation. So I would say, yes, it's going to be a bit uncomfortable in the beginning. It's kind of like any road that you embark on. There's going to be some things that are uncomfortable to do, but they do get easier, right? And so if you have a few really high quality conversations that you feel really good about, that's going to fuel your momentum to continue to have more conversations. And so, yeah, and it's not the first time I've heard that. Some people, I've had some clients say, oh, I had to have a glass of wine before I sent out that connection, or before I sent out that message to that person. And I was like, yeah, I get it. But it's kind of like, once you do it, then you can kind of have that sigh of relief and be proud of yourself. And like with anything, it's going to take a little bit of courage and a little bit of discomfort, but it's better than staying where you are, not moving. It's like you get to choose that discomfort, the discomfort of staying stagnant or the discomfort of moving forward. So that's your choice.
Totally. I love that. And it really is hard. I think if you're not used to reaching out to people on LinkedIn or by email or however, if that's totally foreign to you, that's a pretty steep curve to be climbing. Do you have any recommendations for how you create those conversations? You mentioned approaching the conversation from a position of service, thinking about what value can offer this other person. Do you have any other ideas that somebody could use to prepare for the conversations once they set them up?
Yeah, for sure. So I always have these two questions that I recommend people ask, and it kind of makes sure that you're closing the conversation with putting forward everything that you could to get the favorable response you would want. And I recommend asking without asking. So saying things like, are there any other organizations that you recommend I take a look at? Are there any other people that you can think of that would be beneficial for me to speak to? And so what they hear is, oh, yeah, maybe I do know somebody, or I can introduce you to this person, or maybe there's this, right? And they start going to work for you on what you could do next. And that way, I don't feel like it's asking for a job. It's not asking for anything. It's just saying, if you think of anything, let me know, right? And sometimes they will right away. And sometimes they'll be like, no, I don't. But if I do, I'll let you know. Okay. And not everyone, I will say, like a lot of my clients have had some networking conversations that are not super pleasant. And that's okay. And also had a lot of people who don't respond. And that's also totally fine. All part of it. You're still on the right path.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you said that, Natalie, because it's so true. For all the messages that you send out, you're not going to get 100% response rate. And some conversations are going to be amazing. And some of them will be, they won't leave you feeling as glowing as if you meet somebody who's really keen to hear from you and they have ideas and they're as enthusiastic about your job search as you are. So I'm glad you mentioned that, just to set the expectations. And I think those are expectations that we can set for ourselves, or you can set for yourself as a job seeker, is, okay, I'm going to go out there and do this, knowing that I'm not going to have, it's unlikely to have a 100% success rate.
Yeah. And I mean, it's like that with anything we do. Right. We're going to have some things that don't work and some things that do work. And we're just going to look back and it's just going to be a pile of things that worked and a pile of things that didn't.
Yeah, absolutely. Lessons to be learned in the pile that didn't.
Exactly. And we had to do all those things to get to the end result. So we didn't do anything wrong.
Totally. Natalie, I think you've got many, many strong points and many different insights that you share. And I really love when you start talking about interviews. And one of the questions that I have for you is, in one of your recent podcasts, you talked about a job seeker who had lots of calls, and I wasn't sure if they had interviews as well, but certainly they made it through the door, but they hadn't made it to that next stage. So for example, somebody who does a lot of legwork and then they get the interview, or maybe they've had multiple interviews, but they never get to that next stage. What do you recommend for people who are struggling with that?
Yeah. So I just had a client, and he's going to be a guest on my podcast. And he had it was exactly what you described. He had like a ton of interviews. He had no problem getting the interviews set up. What this shows is that you're qualified on paper. Your skills are in demand. They want what you have to offer. But when they meet you, something's going off. And so what I find normally what's going on there is they're over preparing, and they're falling into that trap of trying to get it right, being a little bit robotic, not showing up as the person who they would be if they were in the role working with their coworkers. So this is something that I do a lot of coaching on, and it's just to pinpoint that the thing that's going wrong, right? And it'll be slightly different for everyone. It's going to be a mindset shift, though. It's going to be definitely something that they're believing that they have to do that's causing them to show up in a certain way that's not landing. Another thing could be they're not sold on their own value, right? So maybe they had somebody help do their resume, and their resume looks great, and then that's working, but they don't really believe that they have what it takes to succeed in this role or to get this role. They might have thoughts that are blocking them energetically, like there's other people that are better than me, or I don't know that I'm really cut out for this opportunity, or, what if I'm not going to be able to deliver? So there could be a lot of things that are getting in the way there. And that's kind of what I do, is help identify and pinpoint what those are. But those, I would say, are the biggest ones.
I love the way that you set that up, Natalie. I think one of the things that you and I talked about, and I did a podcast episode on this a couple of weeks ago, but the idea of blind spots. And I think you do a beautiful job. In fact, maybe you could share that with us. You have a really lovely analogy. Can you share that with us in terms of the blind spot analogy?
Is it the flashlight one?
It's the one with the label. It's so good.
Yeah.
I heard it. You shared it with me when we were working together, and I heard it on one of your podcast episodes. I thought we need to share this because it's such a clear way of describing it.
It's the one where you're stuck inside the jar?
Yes, it's so good. Please
so
share
it's
it.
like kind of what coaching is. It's like when you're stuck inside a jar and you're on the inside of it, and you're trying to read the label on the outside, and you're trying to read all the fine print and stuff, but you can't read it while you're on the inside because it's blurry and it's upside down and it's the wrong way, and like you can't read it. But someone else can come up and just read it to you.
Which I think is so fascinating and so powerful. And I think a lot of the work that you're doing is helping people, especially if they're in that interview stage, right? What is it that's happening in that dialogue, in that discussion that is holding you back? And you talked about the mindset shifts, right? That maybe you're thinking that something like, I'm not qualified enough. I'm too senior for this position. I'm not senior enough. It's outside of my practice area. I don't have the right experience. They're going to take somebody who has more education than me. So there's all these subconscious thoughts, and half the time we're not even aware that we're having them.
Exactly. Yeah.
But then they're feeding into the way that you're talking about yourself in the interview, and other people pick up on them. So I think being able to identify those and then help people through that is such a gift. It's such a gift for the people who you're working with to be able to see that and then take steps to figure out, going back to the idea of the belief point, is it possible that you could have this job without having more years of experience, or without going back and getting an extra accreditation or whatever that happens to be?
Totally. And something came up for me when you were talking about that. A lot of the times when I'm coaching somebody, I'll say, well, how did you answer that question in the interview? And then they give me this answer that's kind of robotic and kind of, cookie cutter. And then if I'm just having a conversation with them, and like they know that I'm not judging them, they know that they're in a safe space. And I say, okay, well, how did you actually do that? Like, just walk me through that. If you were going to teach me how, or how would you actually go about doing that? And then they explain it beautifully and they have no issues communicating it. And it's because they were now in an environment where there was no pressure. And I was like, see, you do know what you're doing. I was like, you actually don't have anything to hide. You actually know all of that stuff. And then they kind of have an aha moment and they're like, oh, and it's because of the way that they're viewing the interview. They're viewing it as this like lion's den where they have to perform.
It's so, oh my gosh, Natalie, it's so true. And I've had that experience where clients go into an interview and they're looking at what they think the interviewers want, as opposed to approaching the interview with the stories that they have and sharing the value that they bring and their reason for being there in the first place. And what ends up happening is what you've described, right? I mean, this is a person who's perfectly capable of explaining with beautiful language and lots of examples and in a very natural way what they're passionate about, the value they can share, but they're so caught up in thinking about what's the right answer, it completely gets watered down. And so absolutely being able to find that story. It's like when you're having a conversation with your friend, telling your friend what you want in a job versus sitting in that interviewee position. And then the wires get crossed. So totally. I love that you shared that, and that for anybody where that's happening, it doesn't have to be like that, that there's actually ways of working on that so that you can show up and present more authentically, to present in alignment with what you want, and showing that to the interviewers.
Yeah, exactly. And I like to have people evaluate themselves on how they showed up. Like, did they show up as their true selves? Are they happy with what they shared? Did they feel like they shared their value? How sold were they on their own value? Like, these are the things that we can control, that we can evaluate. And that's the candidate's job, is to show up so that you can leave saying, I'm proud of that, versus, oh, I hope I got that right. I hope they like me.
Absolutely. And I think that's so much more empowering. And then you've got a place to learn from. So maybe you have a few interviews, but each time you interview, you're doing that self-reflection afterwards and getting closer to the goals that you have for yourself, the way that you want to show up. So
yeah.
I love
and
that.
You're shortening the timeline because you're becoming more valuable as you interview, every time you interview, instead of trying to fit into all these different boxes, because every interviewer is going to quote unquote want something different, and you can't know what that is. So the only thing you can control is showing up how you want to.
Absolutely. Here's another question for you, Natalie. We talked about these mindset shifts. What are some of the shifts that your clients have made that have helped them find their ideal job?
Oh, there are so many really good ones here. So a lot of it stems in realizing their own value, like having a big aha moment about their own value. And it's not something that we normally think about or bring attention to, because why would we, right? You're in the role, you're doing work. And a lot of the times people might even say, you did a good job on that. And they'll be like, yeah, I was just doing my job. No big deal, right? So kind of dismissing their own value, not really knowing what it is. So I think that's the main one. Is really tapping into that. And you might say, oh yeah, I know, or I don't know how to say it, but I know I've brought value. But there's always a deeper level to that, I find. And there's a level where you really are like, wow. And when you get that, it becomes so much easier to go out there and talk about it.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I'm thinking of, there's just so many other ones. I think also, because a lot of my clients, like they'll be really nervous to go on interviews. And so the shift of the paradigm of an interview, not having to be like an interview, it could be just a conversation to see whether or not this is going to be the right fit, whether or not they even want that role.
And do you find that that's enough for them to kind of move out of that robotic kind of nervous energy into something a little bit more conversational?
For some, yeah, for some. Like the shifts are going to be slightly different for everybody, but anything that takes the pressure off you. Right? Like if you're put in an environment where you're not feeling under pressure and you just get to share the facts of what you've done and you're feeling proud and good about yourself, that's where you're going to have the most success.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Seeing like what's possible too. I think a lot of clients have told me that from listening to my podcast and listening to some of the things that people have done through coaching, like being able to make a career transition and increase their salary where they thought that wasn't possible. They'd be like, yeah, but I don't have enough experience. I'm going to have to take a pay cut, or I'm going to have to do this, or just seeing somebody else do it and be like, okay, maybe I can then. Maybe I was wrong about that.
Totally. And Natalie, I'm so glad that you shared that last example, because that is exactly what I was wanting to ask you about. And this is our last question. It's been so fun having you, which is for lawyers who are interested in making a shift. Maybe they're shifting from one practice to another. Maybe they want to shift out of law altogether. And there are certain hangups that are quite common, like I've invested all this time in getting my law degree and practicing as a lawyer. I don't want to lose out on the investment that I've already made. Or maybe it's something like, I really want to go into this other field, but are they going to hire a lawyer? What would you recommend for that person who is looking to maybe explore alternative paths that at the moment just seem like out of reach for them?
Yeah. So the first thing is, I think there's this idea of sunk costs, and kind of like if you're trying to hang on to something just because you've invested a lot of time in it or a lot of money in it, and those are the reasons why you're hanging on to it, but really you don't like it anymore, then it's kind of a question of like, do you like those reasons? Are those good reasons to hang on to something? And for a lot of people, they can be, but then they stop you if you're eventually going to be moving on to something else anyway. And knowing that what you did is never a waste, right? It's never like a complete waste. You always bring that part of you into the next thing that you're doing. And I think for law, that's always going to be useful. And before we were talking, you said, well, what if somebody wants to switch from being a lawyer to an HR professional or something? Like that is going to be hugely useful in HR as well. Right? There's always going to be. And so I would say, like, how can you use what you have to help you succeed and bring a unique kind of style to the next thing you want to do? Right? How can you use it? And there's always going to be an answer to that. There's always going to be a way that you can use it. And it's always going to make you better at what you're doing next. So assessing the reasons why you want to make that change, whether you like those reasons, and then going all in with being like, no, this is what I'm doing. And this is how it's going to be great. This is why I'm going to be even better at it, because I got my law degree.
And I love how you frame that, Natalie, because it's really, what are the questions that you're asking yourself? And the ones that I'm hearing from you is, how is my past experience going to support me in this next role? How does this past experience make me an excellent candidate for this role? And so asking yourself those questions and coming up with those answers, you then are reinforcing the value, which is what you had been talking about earlier, right? How do you show up feeling like you've got that value to contribute? This is one of those ways where you can actually start to see it for yourself by asking yourself those questions and focusing on that instead of, well, I'm wasting, I've wasted the last 10 years of my life. Instead of looking at it from that perspective, it's like, what have I learned over the past 10 years that is setting me up for success in this next position?
Exactly. Yes. And when you're interviewing and when you're thinking that way, when you're like, okay, well, I have this law degree, and using it as like the most powerful tool, even if the job is for, let's say for example's sake, an HR professional or whatever thing you might want to do next. If you're going in there thinking, oh, they don't care about my law degree, it's useless now, I'm doing this new thing, I have to go get new stuff, you're going to kind of kibosh the value that could give you, right? So if you're thinking of it in terms of the law degree could be super valuable for them, how could I apply it? How could I incorporate it in what this role needs? How could I help them achieve their goal using this knowledge and skill? Then you're going to be looking for things, and then the value is going to come out. It's going to be easier to find.
Absolutely. So great. Natalie, thank you. You're so amazing. I'm just delighted to have you here.
Thank you.
I'm thinking of all the listeners who are benefiting from your wisdom. I'm sure that they want to know more about where they can find you, how they can work with you. So can you tell us what that looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing, if you want to come on over to my podcast, as Paula mentioned earlier, it's called Get a Six-Figure Job You Love podcast. You can find it on iTunes. Yeah, you can go over there, just dig through, see if there's anything that catches your attention. And from there, you can learn about everything else that I do.
Beautiful. And what about clients who want to work with you? What kind of offerings do you have? Are you still coaching or?
My program is called the Six-Figure Curriculum, and it's where I take everything that I've learned from all my one-on-one clients and put it all into one. So everything is there for landing your first six-figure role or your next six-figure role. From building the self-confidence to opening up the opportunities to interviewing. I have a concept called whole interviewing, where you interview as your whole self, kind of what we touched on today, aligning with the salary that you want, and then setting yourself up for the maximum impact that you could have in your career. So it's called the 6-Figure Curriculum. And yeah, you can learn about it if you go to my website, www.nataliefisher.ca. But yeah, I'd recommend starting with the podcast.
So beautiful. Thank you so much, Natalie. And yes, we are going to provide links to all of these sources in the show notes. I love that you just said, what is the maximum impact that you can make in your career? Because it reminds me of how I first learned of you. Natalie was interviewed in a podcast and I listened to it, and she mentioned that this is a question that she asks her clients. What is the maximum career impact that you can make? And it is such an opening question for somebody to think about, and maybe one that we haven't thought about. And so thank you, Natalie.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, that's what it's all about. It's expanding your mind, because if you don't have intentions for these things, then the likelihood of getting there is lower.
And you're the one who can show us how to get there.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Natalie. It's been such a treat reconnecting with you.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you.
And thanks for everyone listening.
Oh, thank you to everyone listening, and hope you enjoyed this week's podcast with Natalie Fisher. She is amazing. Bye, Natalie.
Bye.
If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.